We're now at the point where we're going to get to the rear shock tower, and you can see here I've got the original carbon fibre that comes with all GALMs, and then the 10th anniversary kit also includes a red version of the aluminium rear shock tower that, as you can see, has 36 positions. It's a very, very good option, and it's one that I use all the time. I'm going to do a quick comparison of weight. This isn't quite accurate because I'm not going to include the screws here, but it's close enough. But you'll see, obviously, the aluminium one is going to be significantly more heavy. So it's 15 grams. And if I weigh the carbon, it's 5.35. So the difference between these two options is 10 grams. I'm still going to run the aluminium version because I think it offers you quicker and easier adjustment, as well as more lateral rigidity. The damper angle that I'm using is going to be on the lower side. This is the setup sheet that we're basing it from. Obviously, it's something that gets tweaked and tuned, and if the customer decides to go for a high motor or rear motor, he's almost certainly going to change all of these angles. This is just a baseline I'm delivering the car to him with. He's been waiting for some time now for this to be finished, so there's a lot of parts ready to go on that aren't going to be included in this build, just because the spec we agreed was from before they were available. So hopefully this is going to be, he's going to enjoy the starting point for this car, and then he can tweak it to suit himself. So I'm not going to put the body post on this. That's something I'm going to leave for the customer. He does have the Overdose aluminium body mounts to go on the back of this, but I'm going to let him mount his body as he wants. So I'm just going to put these screws in. But if you were doing this yourself, you would definitely be putting the screws in here first, just because of the position that this is going to end up being in, which is roughly there. You can see that extension that the damper mounts to is actually going to protrude. So we're in the lower position of the 36. The standard resin camber link mount is 2.75 grams, and the aluminium version is 6.9. So the weight's not exact because there is also a couple of nuts as well as the extra screws and stuff, but it is height adjustable. It is well worth having. It's a must-have upgrade for me. So I think you can see nicely here that this camber link mount is height adjustable, and I've pushed it all the way down to put this point as low as possible to increase the angle of the camber link. The length of the camber arm and the angle of the camber arm changes the amount of camber gain and the speed of the camber gain. And if you increase the outer height and decrease the inner height, angling it upwards, you generally make it easier to find the traction. So these knuckles are actually due to restock again soon. They've been out of stock for quite a while, hence the reason the customer sourced them elsewhere. And you can see from the header card it's a bit old, but they're brand new, never been used, so they should be all good. So this might also be a good point to talk about the options for hexes, because front knuckles are standard, obviously include a standard steel shaft. Customers decided to do the same as me, which is to use the 6mm one-piece integrated aluminium shafts. These are essentially, they're very fancy, very nice. They're also super smooth, and it's just a nice option to have. They're by no means essential, but they work really well. They look very pretty, so the customer's going for them. So we won't be using those axles. We also have the optional aluminium hexes. These are the 6mm version that came in red. Customer's going to use these on the rear rather than on the front as well, obviously, because we're going to use these instead. So I'm going to assemble the knuckles, and these are going to go on, and then we'll get the other hexes on the back. We're going to go for 5 degrees kingpin angle. We're just looking at my setup sheet that we're basing this from. 5 degrees kingpin angle and position 5 on the Ackerman adjustment, and we're going to build them as standard with standard trail. So these are obviously multi-piece knuckles, and you can adjust the KPI by rotating or swapping this block left to right. So you can see that you've got 0, 3, 5 or 8 degrees KPI, and that just simply lines up like this. So that will sit in there, and whichever number the arrow is pointing at is your KPI angle. You can also use the 2 different positions for different widths if you wanted to, although generally that's not really required. And you can space to adjust the trail angle. So you can space the axle forward or back to change where it sits in relation to the ball studs that sit top and bottom. So there is a spacer that sits in the centre of the axle when you build these. I'm going to put the outer bearing in, then you have your axle that goes in. Then you have this small spacer, then your inner bearing sits in there like that. And then you have this small countersunk washer and a smaller screw, and that secures the axle into the knuckle. And the countersunk washer will locate into the centre of the bearing, so you need to make sure you nip it up properly. Because it's quite difficult to hold on to this and make sure this screw is tight. Obviously, you're not going to go crazy tight on the back, but you don't want this screw or washer falling off, so you just nip it up while inserting it in the wheel, because it's easier to grip this than it is the hex itself here. And then that's nice and smooth. See, it's going to be set. This is the left knuckle that you can see there, and you can see that it's going to be set at 5 degrees kpi. And as standard, this is using a 2mm spacer for trail. Unfortunately, I don't have these cap head screws in stainless, which is a bit of a shame because it would have been nice. I'm going to put the 2mm spacers on. So we're going to put them together like that. Place it into position before just very gently getting the screws started. You can see again, I'm not holding the driver at the end. They don't require a lot of torque, and I'll just give them a little nip when they're at the end. So that's the correct amount of trail. So you can see there what I was talking about before, where the axle has been pulled fractionally forward from where the ball stud is going to sit. Next up, we need to set the Ackerman position. You can see that there is a mark that is on the end here, which I'm not going to be able to show you, but there's a little dimple on one of the steps. That's the default standard position they recommend. I choose to go 1 in for this setup. So you can see there, hopefully, I've set it 1 notch off the dot. It's worth mentioning when you're doing this, you need to be very careful not to damage the teeth that control the adjustment, because they're very tiny, very fine. Both of those done. They're both matching. Next up, we've got the lock stops, and I'm just going to set this to a basic position. So these wheel nuts are just going to sit in place to keep them from being lost. And these are quite nice because instead of using a regular nut, you use a screw and the washer nut, I suppose you could call it. So now I need to make some steering turnbuckles. This is where I'm going to use the option part finer turnbuckles, the different thread pitch. So these ones are super fine. Basically, the adjustment is much more fine. Obviously, when I'm doing this with these, it's going to take a lot more turning. Now, I'm going to be doing a full geometry setup on this car when it's actually all together on its own wheels. One of the things you've got to watch when you're assembling the front end of a fresh GALM is if you don't have the spaces that the manual tells you to put under the arms, the ball studs actually protrude quite far from the bottom of the bulkhead, and they can actually catch your steering links, which you can see there. They're just touching, and when you, depending on the arm angle, it does change a lot, but you need to just be careful of that. If your steering is binding when your car is actually on the deck, then that's something to look for. It's something I'll tweak if I need to. You can just shave the steering links a tiny bit if you needed to, or put a smaller spacer in here. So the customer's going to be running the same setup that I run in my own GALM, which is the KO Propo RSX3 version D servo, which is superb, mega smooth, and my all-time favourite servo, along with the Overdose two-way servo mount and the JT servo horn. So we're just going to get this servo out of this combo pack. It also includes the KGX, which is the same as the Overdose Dice gyro, which again is my favourite at the moment and has been since it launched. It's a beautiful servo. It's amongst the smoothest, and I also really like that KO include a small dot that lets you know where centre is on the gear, which is super helpful. The Junta JT spec servo horn is handy because you can actually adjust the length of it, and so I'm going to set this to 20mm. One thing I like to do when I'm putting a servo into its servo mount is to basically do it flat on the deck so that you can push the servo down to make contact with the lower deck so that it all sits flush, and that way you know that the servo is basically going to sit square in the chassis. Again, nothing needs to be cranked up too tight. Incidentally, with the GALM, the standard servo position is about 10 degrees off centre, so that's centre for this chassis. Now we've got the excellent KO Propo RSX3 110 version D servo installed. I may have to trim the centre and things like that before I actually deliver to the customer, but it looks like it's about spot on to me. I do prefer to have aluminium hexes on because they're more precise and accurate. It's always worth just pulling the axle a little bit as you're pushing the hex on, and obviously do not over tighten these nuts. They need to be nipped up, but they're only tiny. If you put them on and try and pull them and they don't come off, they're tight enough. Don't forget that the wheel also holds the hex in place. You can do a very quick weight comparison between the two battery holder options. Customer's going to go for the nice aluminium one. I normally end up running the plastic one just because of weight. There is a couple of extra parts to go in here. Obviously there's screws and there's a small O-ring and a post that aren't in there. But you can see we're at basically 39 grams. Plastic version missing the screws, and both of these are without the post to raise the height because I know the customer's using a short battery. But we're looking at 11.45. Well, there's a huge weight saving to be had by going for the plastic battery tray over the aluminium. But the aluminium does look super nice and is very, very high quality and very nice to use. So we're going to start out there, and the customer has both options so he can do whatever he chooses. So you can see here how the battery tray works. This carbon plate is part of the trans-range set because this will actually hang from the top deck underneath this part here. So you can adjust the height of the battery for more or less body roll. You can also obviously mount it straight to the deck if you wanted to as well. But the cool thing about the aluminium battery tray is it's got this little latch that you just turn that, lift it up, you slide your pack in and out, and then drop that down, lock it quickly. Right, now we're moving on to the aluminium damper mount. You can see that there's a spacer included with this, with the aluminium damper mount, just to raise the ball studs. That is obviously a tuning option for you. You can change the spacer, remove the spacer, increase the spacer, and it changes the position of the damper on the mount. And obviously the other bonus of this aluminium damper mount is that you can change the length of the damper. So that's the longest position, the middle position, and then the shortest position. The standard resin version is 6.35 grams and the aluminium option is 13.8 grams. So we're looking at double the weight, and it's actually very helpfully illustrated in the manual here. You've got this option here to change the damper length, but also you can space the ball studs out to move the dampers outwards, which is similar to, it's kind of the same effect that you get if you're moving your dampers outwards than a traditional shock tower. So now we've got the top deck on with the front aluminium damper mount in. You can see how high the battery's been raised there. So by default, there are some posts that are included to reduce this height, because it's assumed that you're running thicker batteries, so you need to space this down. But because I believe the customer's using the same super slim lipos as me, I've run without those posts so that the battery's even higher. Because it is a lightweight super slim battery, it just means that you can raise the battery to get a bit more roll using less weight. We're just going to look at the different options you got for bumpers on the GALM. There are some aluminium ones I'm not going to include because I currently don't have them to hand. The TC bumper, which is the one we're going to go for, ignoring any screws or body posts, is 4.4 grams, which is pretty light. If you compare that just to the base plate alone of the plastic bumper, that's 8.5 grams, so almost half the weight. And there's also another plate that would go on top of this with posts between them. So it's definitely a lighter option to go for the TC bumper, which is super nice looking as well. You can see here that I'm using 3 screws. You can save even more weight by leaving out the centre screw if you wanted to, but for me, I prefer to have the 3 in. I think it just looks nicer, and they're only 5mm screws, they don't weigh a lot at all. So the last job for today was to install the spur gear and the 10th anniversary limited edition spur gear plate, which you can see here is number 40 of 50 that were made in red. There were obviously 50 in purple as well, but this is number 40. It's also a 92 tooth spur that comes as standard because this is a GALM version 2 kit that this is based on. The 2 Plus comes with an 88 as standard, and this incidentally is made by Kawada, which is probably my favourite spur gear manufacturer. They're superb. That's everything we've done for today. The only things we've got left to do now are to build the dampers, which I'm going to do as a separate episode on its own, install the electronics, which shouldn't take too long, and do a final geometry setup ready to deliver to the customer. Thanks for watching, and if you'd like to see more episodes like this or more projects like this, please consider subscribing and sharing with your friends.